deceptive tranquility over the Pacific Ocean. Captain Richard Fleming adjusted his flight goggles as he prepared his Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bomber on the flight deck of the USS Yorktown. Little did he know that within hours, the azure waters surrounding Midway Atoll would become the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation supremacy. Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his forces with the precision of a chess master. The American Pacific Fleet, though outnumbered, held one crucial advantage. They had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25. Every move Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned was known to the Americans days in advance. The trap was set, and the Japanese combined fleet was sailing directly into it. At 0 for 30 hours, the first wave of Japanese aircraft launched from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 108 planes Nakajima B-5N, Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters streaked toward Midway Atoll. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga, the rising sun painted on their wings glinted in the early morning light as they formed up in perfect attack formation. On Midway itself, radar operator Private Joseph McDonald detected the incoming formation at a distance of 93 miles. His voice cracked as he reported the contact to the command center. Many planes, bearing 320, distance 93 miles. The island's air raid sirens began their mournful wail, and every American fighter pilot on Midway scrambled to their aircraft. The first to meet the Japanese assault were the obsolete Grumman F-4F Wildcats and Brewster F-2A Buffaloes of Marine Fighting Squadron 221, led by Major Floyd Parks. Though their aircraft were technologically inferior to the Japanese Zeros, the American pilots possessed something the enemy had not anticipated: unbreakable determination and intimate knowledge of their home waters. As the two air armadas clashed above the coral reefs of Midway, the sky erupted in a deadly ballet of tracer fire and exploding aircraft. The Japanese pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, initially dominated the engagement. Zero after zero dove through the American formations, their 20mm cannons chattering death. But for every American plane that fell, the defenders extracted a terrible price. Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, flying one of the few remaining Wildcats, found himself alone against 3 Zeros. Banking sharply to avoid their attack, he witnessed something that would haunt him forever: a Japanese Val dive bomber, its wings shredded by anti-aircraft fire, spiraling down toward the lagoon trailing black smoke. The pilot, probably no older than 20, made no attempt to bail out. His aircraft struck the water with a tremendous splash, and the Pacific Ocean claimed another son of Japan. According to the Naval Historical Center's official records, the opening phase of the Battle of Midway saw unprecedented ferocity in aerial combat, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in the first 30 minutes of engagement. As the morning progressed, it became clear that this would be no ordinary battle. The Japanese had expected to find Midway lightly defended, but instead encountered a hornet's nest of American resistance. Every airfield, every gun emplacement, every radar station had been prepared for this moment. The Pacific Theater's fate would be decided not by battleship guns or carrier tonnage, but by the courage of young men fighting in the sky above a tiny coral atoll. The stage was set for what would become the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history. As Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga's first wave pounded Midway's installations, the island's fierce defensive fire began to exact its toll. The American anti-aircraft gunners, many of them Marines who had never seen combat, stood to their weapons with grim determination. Staff Sergeant William Horan, manning a 3-inch gun emplacement, watched as his crew tracked a diving Val bomber through the morning sky. "Steady, boys," Horan called out over the thunderous barrage. "Make every shot count." His gun crew, consisting of Privates James Morrison, Robert Kelly, and Thomas Anderson, worked with mechanical precision despite the chaos erupting around them. The 3-inch shell caught the Japanese dive bomber just as it released its payload, and the aircraft disintegrated in a brilliant orange fireball. The Japanese pilots, however, were not easily deterred. Commander Tomonaga himself led his bombers in repeated attacks against the Marine positions. 36 aircraft to 27, but still they pressed their assault. The fuel storage tanks on Eastern Island erupted in towering columns of black smoke, and the power plant took a direct hit that plunged half the installation into darkness. Captain William Humbird, commanding the 6th Defense Battalion, coordinated the ground defense from his command bunker. Reports flooded in from all sectors: Japanese fighters strafing the runway, dive bombers attacking the seaplane hangars, casualties mounting in Sector 7. But with each report came another piece of encouraging news: to enemy aircraft. Down over the lagoon, Zero seen crashing into the reef. Japanese formation breaking up under anti-aircraft fire. The morning's first phase belonged to the Japanese attackers, but at a cost they had not anticipated. Of the 108 aircraft that had launched from the Japanese carriers, only 83 would return. The American defenders had drawn first blood, and it was Japanese blood that stained the coral sands of Midway. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the northwest, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma aboard his flagship Akagi. His returning pilots reported that Midway's defenses were far stronger than intelligence had indicated. Commander Tominaga radioed that a second attack would be necessary to neutralize the American positions, but Nagumo also knew that American carrier forces were somewhere in the area. Though he did not yet know exactly where. The Japanese admiral made a fateful decision. At 07:15 hours, he ordered his second wave of aircraft, originally armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking American ships, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a ground attack mission. This process would take over an hour, leaving his flight decks cluttered with ammunition and fuel lines. Captain Richard Fleming, who had witnessed the Japanese attack from his position on the Yorktown, knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The American task forces, under the overall command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, were closing in on the Japanese fleet. But first, they had to deal with the immediate threat to Midway itself. At 07:55 hours, the second wave of Japanese attacks began. This time, however, the Americans were ready. The radar operators had maintained constant surveillance, and every available fighter was already airborne. Captain John Carey, leading Marine Fighter Squadron 223, positioned his Wildcats between the incoming Japanese formation and the island. The aerial combat that followed was unlike anything seen before in the Pacific War. Japanese Zeros, despite their superior maneuverability, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer determination of the American pilots. Second Lieutenant William Brooks, flying his first combat mission, shot down to Japanese aircraft in rapid succession. Before his own Wildcat was riddled with cannon fire, he managed to nurse his damaged aircraft back to the runway, where ground crews counted over 40 bullet holes in the fuselage as the sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky. The waters around Midway began to fill with the debris of aerial combat. Oil slicks marked the spots where aircraft had crashed, and rescue boats from both sides raced to pick up downed pilots. The Japanese had succeeded in damaging Midway's facilities, but they had failed to eliminate the island's ability to launch aircraft. More importantly, they had revealed their position to the American carrier forces. The Battle of Midway was about to enter its most crucial phase. At 08:30 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey prepared to launch from the USS Enterprise with his dive bomber squadron. The flight deck buzzed with activity as 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft were positioned for takeoff. McCluskey, a seasoned pilot with over 2,000 flight hours, knew that this mission would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, had made his decision. While the Japanese were busy rearming their aircraft for a second attack on Midway, the American carriers would strike at the heart of Nagumo's fleet. The timing had to be perfect. Catch the Japanese carriers with their decks full of fuel and ammunition, and the enemy's naval aviation would be crippled in a single blow. The American strike force consisted of 156 aircraft from 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, while Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay commanded Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise. These obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers would have to approach the Japanese carriers at low altitude, making them easy targets for the Zero fighters. At 0920 hours, the first American aircraft reached the Japanese fleet. What they found was a formation of 4 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, protected by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Japanese ships stretched across the horizon like a steel city floating on the Pacific swells. Lieutenant Commander Waldron led his 15 Devastators in a desperate attack against the carrier Soryu. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of over 50 Zero fighters, fell upon the slow-moving American torpedo bombers like hawks attacking pigeons. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Waldron's aircraft was among the first to fall, his torpedo bomber crashing into the sea in a geyser of spray and flames. Historical records from the Naval War College indicate that Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice was crucial in drawing down the Japanese fighter cover, setting the stage for the decisive dive bomber attacks that followed. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in the Pacific waters and watched in horror as his squadron mates perished around him. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The Zero fighters, having descended to sea level to engage the torpedo bombers, were now out of position to defend against the dive bombers, approaching from high altitude. At 10:24 hours, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey spotted the Japanese carriers through a gap in the clouds. The sight that greeted him was beyond his wildest expectations. For aircraft carriers with their flight decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft, the Japanese were caught in their most vulnerable moment, their ship's decks resembling floating ammunition dumps. "This is it, boys," McCluskey radioed to his squadron. "We'll never get a better chance than this." The dauntless dive bombers rolled over and began their screaming descent toward the Japanese carriers. The angle was nearly vertical, and the American pilots had to fight against gravity and G-forces to maintain control of their aircraft. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading one section of dive bombers, selected the carrier Akagi as his target. Admiral Nagumo's flagship was easily recognizable by its distinctive island structure and the admiral's flag flying from its mast. Best's 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb struck the carrier just aft of the island, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay among the armed aircraft. The explosion aboard Akagi was catastrophic. Armed aircraft, aviation fuel, and ammunition combined to create a chain reaction of secondary explosions. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. Similar scenes played out aboard Kaga and Soryu. As American bombs found their marks with devastating precision, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading the dive bombers from Yorktown, targeted the carrier Soryu. His attack was equally successful, with multiple bomb hits setting the carrier ablaze from stem to stern. The Japanese damage control parties, trained and experienced though they were, could do nothing against the intensity of the fires. By 11:30 hours, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Hundreds of aircraft and thousands of trained aircrew was being consumed by flames and sinking beneath the Pacific waves. The trap that Admiral Nimitz had set months earlier had finally sprung shut, and the Japanese combined fleet was caught in its deadly embrace. But the battle was far from over. One Japanese carrier remained operational, and its aircraft were already preparing for a revenge strike against the American fleet. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on the bridge of the burning carrier Soryu, his white uniform stained with smoke, and his face set in grim determination. As his ship listed heavily to starboard, he refused all entreaties from his staff to abandon the vessel. "I will share the fate of my ship," he declared, tying himself to the bridge compass. The captain's sacrifice embodied the samurai spirit that had driven Japan to war, even as that same spirit was being consumed by the fires of defeat. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, launched a desperate counterattack at 13:30 hours. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, and 6-0 fighters toward the American task force. Their target was the USS Yorktown, the carrier that had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea and pressed into service for this crucial engagement. Aboard the Yorktown, Captain Elliot Buckmaster had been monitoring the battle reports with growing confidence. 3 Japanese carriers were reported burning, and the American strike aircraft were beginning to return from their successful mission. But the celebration was premature. Radar operators suddenly detected incoming aircraft bearing down on their position. General quarters, all hands to battle stations. The announcement echoed throughout the ship as sailors ran to their positions. The carrier's air group, which had just returned from attacking the Japanese fleet, was hurriedly refueled and rearmed. But there was no time to launch additional fighter cover before the Japanese attack commenced. The Japanese dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Kobayashi, approached from the southeast through scattered clouds. The American Combat Air Patrol, consisting of only 12 F-4F Wildcats, was hopelessly outnumbered. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, the squadron leader, maneuvered his fighters with desperate skill, but the Japanese Zeros proved too numerous and too skilled. At 14:45 hours, the first Japanese bombs struck the Yorktown. Lieutenant Kobayashi's aircraft, diving nearly vertically through the intense anti-aircraft fire, scored a direct hit on the carrier's flight deck. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrated 3 decks before exploding in the ship's interior, killing dozens of sailors and starting fierce fires in the forward section. 2 more bombs followed in rapid succession. The second hit near the island's superstructure, destroying the ship's radar and communication systems. The third bomb struck the forward elevator, jamming it in the up position and rendering the flight deck partially unusable. Within minutes, the pride of the American Pacific Fleet was listing to port and burning. But the Yorktown's damage control parties, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich, performed miracles of seamanship, working in smoke-filled compartments with temperatures exceeding 150 degrees. They contained the fires and corrected the ship's list. By 15:30 hours, the carrier was once again making 20 knots and preparing to recover aircraft. However, the Japanese were not finished. At 16:45 hours, a second wave of attack aircraft from the Hiryu appeared on the horizon. This time, it was torpedo bombers 10 Nakajima B-5 N-Kate aircraft, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had survived the morning's attack on Midway, but whose aircraft was too damaged to return to his carrier. The torpedo attack was executed with the precision that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black puffs of smoke, the Kate bombers pressed their attack to point-blank range. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown on her port side, and the explosions knocked out the ship's power plant and caused severe flooding. This time, the damage was too severe to repair at sea. Captain Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship, and over 2,000 sailors were evacuated to nearby destroyers. The Yorktown, which had played such a crucial role in the American victory, was left dead in the water. Naval combat reports from the Pacific Fleet archives document that despite the loss of Yorktown, American morale remained high due to the successful elimination of 3 Japanese carriers earlier in the day. But even as the Americans mourned the loss of their carrier, the final act of the Battle of Midway was beginning. The Hiryu, having launched her last operational aircraft, was now defenseless against American retaliation. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, his dive bombers refueled and rearmed, was already plotting the coordinates for one final strike. At 1700 hours, as the sun began to set over the Pacific, the American revenge was swift and terrible. 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise found the Hiryu steaming alone, her escorts having been drawn away by submarine contacts. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes, but it was enough to seal the fate of the last Japanese carrier. 4 direct hits transformed the Hiryu into a blazing wreck. Admiral Yamaguchi, like Captain Yanagimoto before him, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the disgrace of defeat. By midnight on June 5, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers had either sunk or been scuttled by their own forces. The sun was setting on the Japanese Empire's naval supremacy, and with it, their dreams of Pacific conquest, the dawn of June 5, 1942, revealed the true magnitude of the carnage that had unfolded in the waters around Midway. Debris fields stretched for miles across the Pacific swells, fragments of aircraft, life rafts, oil slicks, and the occasional survivor clinging to floating wreckage. The sea itself seemed to mourn the young men who had perished in the previous day's battle. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, exhausted after 36 hours of continuous operations, stood on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise and surveyed the aftermath. His dive bomber squadron had struck the decisive blow against the Japanese fleet, but victory had come at a terrible cost. Of the 41 aircraft that had launched from the Enterprise the previous morning, only 24 had returned. 17 young American aviators would never see their homes again. The human toll on both sides was staggering. The Japanese had lost over 3,000 sailors and aviators, including many of their most experienced pilots. Admiral Nagumo's first mobile force, which had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, had been virtually annihilated. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the spearhead of Japanese naval power, now lay beneath thousands of feet of Pacific water. Captain Wilfred Holmes, the intelligence officer who had helped break the Japanese naval code, received reports throughout the morning from search aircraft combing the battle area. The USS Yorktown, abandoned but still afloat, was being stalked by Japanese submarines. The destroyer USS Hammond, attempting to assist in salvage operations, had been torpedoed and sunk by the submarine I-168. The sea around the crippled carrier was littered with survivors, both American and Japanese, waiting for rescue. On Midway Atoll itself, the defenders were counting their own losses. Captain William Humbard's 6th Defense Battalion had lost 43 Marines killed and 78 wounded during the Japanese air attacks. The runways were cratered, the fuel storage tanks destroyed, and most of the base facilities damaged. But the island was still in American hands, and that was what mattered most. Major Floyd Parks, whose Marine Fighter Squadron had borne the brunt of the Japanese attack, sat in his damaged command post writing letters to the families of his fallen pilots. 12 of his 21 pilots had been killed in action, including several who had been flying combat missions for the first time. The words came slowly, each sentence a struggle to convey the heroism and sacrifice of young men who had given their lives to defend a coral atoll most Americans had never heard of. The strategic implications of the battle were already becoming clear to military planners in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, received Admiral Nimitz's preliminary battle report with a mixture of relief and amazement. The Japanese combined fleet, which had seemed invincible just days earlier, had suffered a defeat from which it would never fully recover. According to declassified documents from the National Archives, intelligence analysts immediately recognized that the Battle of Midway represented a fundamental shift in the Pacific balance of power, with Japan losing its offensive capability and the United States gaining the initiative. But the victory was not without its controversies. The devastating losses suffered by the torpedo squadrons raised questions about American tactics and equipment. The Douglas TBD Devastator, obsolete before the war began, had proven to be a death trap for its crews. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that had attacked the Japanese fleet, only 6 had returned to their carriers. The sacrifice of these airmen had been crucial to the American victory, but it highlighted the desperate improvisation that characterized the early Pacific War. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding the USS Hornet, faced the most difficult task of all, explaining to the families of Torpedo Squadron 8 why their sons and husbands had been sent to certain death in obsolete aircraft. The entire squadron, except for Ensign George Gay, had been wiped out in a matter of minutes, yet their sacrifice had drawn down the Japanese fighter cover and made possible the successful dive bomber attacks that followed. The Japanese, meanwhile, were struggling to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation, remained aboard his flagship Yamato, 300 miles from the battle area. His elaborate plan to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle had succeeded, but the outcome was the exact opposite of what he had intended. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced air groups was a blow from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. More than the ships themselves, it was the loss of trained pilots that would prove decisive. The Japanese Naval Aviation Training Program, which had produced the elite airmen who had attacked Pearl Harbor, could not be quickly replaced. The survivors of Midway would form the nucleus of future Japanese air units, but their numbers were pitifully small. As rescue operations continued throughout the day, both sides began the grim task of assessing their losses and planning for the future. The Battle of Midway had lasted less than 24 hours, but its consequences would reverberate throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The sun set on June 5, 1942, painting the Pacific waters around Midway in shades of crimson that seemed to reflect the blood spilled in the previous day's battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor reading the final damage reports. The scope of the American victory was almost beyond belief, for Japanese aircraft carriers sunk with minimal losses to his own forces. The USS Yorktown, abandoned and listing heavily to port, finally succumbed to her wounds at dawn on June 7th. The proud carrier, which had fought valiantly at the Coral Sea and Midway, slipped beneath the waves with a dignity that befitted her service. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, watching from the deck of a nearby destroyer, saluted as his ship disappeared beneath the Pacific swells. The loss of the Yorktown was a heavy blow, but it paled in comparison to the devastation inflicted upon the Japanese fleet across the Pacific. In the war rooms of Tokyo, the magnitude of the defeat was slowly sinking in. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, staring at the casualty reports. The first mobile force, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, had been utterly destroyed. For fleet carriers, over 100 aircraft and nearly 3,000 skilled naval personnel had been lost in a single day. The human cost was staggering on both sides, but the strategic implications were even more profound. Emperor Hirohito, receiving the news in his palace in Tokyo, understood immediately that the war had taken a decisive turn. The Imperial Navy, which had seemed invincible after Pearl Harbor, had suffered a defeat that would take years to remedy if it could be remedied at all. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was recovering from appendicitis aboard the carrier Akagi when the American bombs struck. Evacuated to a nearby cruiser, he watched in horror as his ship was consumed by flames. The symbolism was not lost on him. The same aircraft that had delivered the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor were now being destroyed by American bombers. The implications extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The Japanese war plan had been based on the assumption that a series of quick victories would force the United States to negotiate a peace settlement. The Battle of Midway shattered that assumption. Instead of seeking peace, the Americans had demonstrated their ability to fight back with devastating effectiveness. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received the news of the victory with quiet satisfaction. The United States had been on the defensive since Pearl Harbor, but Midway marked the beginning of the American offensive in the Pacific. The industrial might of America, already being mobilized for war, would now be directed toward the reconquest of the Pacific. Military historians from the Naval War College later documented that the Battle of Midway represented the turning point of the Pacific War, shifting the strategic initiative from Japan to the United States for the remainder of the conflict. The lessons of Midway would influence naval warfare for decades to come. The battle had demonstrated the decisive importance of naval aviation and the vulnerability of surface fleets to air attack. The age of the battleship was ending, and the era of the aircraft carrier was beginning. Future naval battles would be fought not by massive gun batteries, but by squadrons of aircraft operating hundreds of miles from their bases. For the surviving participants, the Battle of Midway would remain the defining moment of their lives. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose dive bombers had struck the fatal blow against the Japanese carriers, would be awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership, but he would carry the memory of his fallen comrades for the rest of his days. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued from the Pacific waters after floating for 30 hours. His testimony provided crucial intelligence about Japanese damage, control procedures, and ship construction. But more importantly, his survival served as a reminder of the price paid by the men who had made victory possible. The Japanese survivors faced a different kind of burden. Many of them, trained in the tradition of Bushido, felt that they had failed their emperor and their nation. Some, like Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Yanagimoto, had chosen death rather than survival. Others would carry the shame of defeat for the remainder of their lives. As the debris of battle was cleared from the waters around Midway, both sides began the process of rebuilding their shattered fleets. But the strategic balance had shifted irrevocably. The Japanese, who had controlled the Pacific for 6 months, would spend the rest of the war fighting a defensive battle against an increasingly powerful American offensive. The Battle of Midway had lasted less than a week, but its consequences would shape the course of the Pacific War. 6 months after the Battle of Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the deck of the USS Enterprise as it sailed through the waters. Where the decisive battle had been fought, the sea was calm, showing no trace of the carnage that had occurred beneath its surface. But the legacy of those 4 days in June 1942 would echo through the remainder of the Pacific War and beyond. The strategic consequences of Midway were already becoming apparent across the Pacific theater. The Japanese, robbed of their carrier-based aviation, had been forced to abandon their offensive operations and retreat to a defensive perimeter. The Solomon Islands campaign, which had begun with the American invasion of Guadalcanal in August 1942, marked the beginning of the long American advance across the Pacific. Captain Richard Fleming, who had witnessed the battle from the flight deck of the Yorktown, was now serving as air operations officer aboard the new carrier USS Essex. The American shipbuilding program, which had seemed impossibly ambitious before the war, was now producing aircraft carriers at a rate the Japanese could not match. For every carrier lost at Midway, the Americans were building 3 new ones. The human cost of the battle continued to reverberate through both nations. In small towns across America, families received official notifications of their sons' deaths in action. The telegram informing Mrs. John Waldron of her husband's death in leading Torpedo Squadron 8 was typical of thousands of such messages. But these personal tragedies were tempered by the knowledge that their sacrifice had not been in vain, that the Japanese faced a different kind of reckoning. The loss of experienced pilots at Midway had created a training crisis that would plague the Japanese Navy for the rest of the war. The replacements who filled the ranks of the depleted air groups lacked the skill and experience of the veterans who had been lost. This pilot shortage would become increasingly apparent. As the war progressed, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation, never fully recovered from the defeat. His confidence in the invincibility of the Japanese fleet had been shattered, and he would spend the remainder of his life cut short by an American ambush in April 1943, trying to develop a defensive strategy that could halt the American advance. The technological lessons of Midway were being absorbed by both sides. The American success with dive bombers led to improved aircraft design and better training for aircrew. The Japanese, meanwhile, began developing new aircraft and tactics designed to counter American numerical superiority. But technology alone could not overcome the fundamental shift in strategic balance that had occurred at Midway. Recent scholarship from the Pacific War Research Society has emphasized that the Battle of Midway represented not just a tactical victory, but a fundamental change in the nature of naval warfare itself, establishing the aircraft carrier as the dominant naval weapons system. For the men who had fought at Midway, the battle remained a defining moment that would shape their understanding of war and sacrifice. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, whose Thatchweave fighter tactics had helped American pilots survive against superior Japanese aircraft, would go on to become one of the Navy's premier tacticians. His innovations, born from the desperate fighting at Midway, would save countless American lives in subsequent battles. The lessons of Midway extended far beyond military tactics. The battle had demonstrated the importance of intelligence, preparation, and leadership in warfare. Admiral Nimitz's decision to trust the intelligence provided by his codebreakers and Admiral Spruance's tactical decisions during the battle had proven decisive. These leadership lessons would be studied by military academies for decades to come. The Battle of Midway also marked a turning point in American public opinion about the war. The victory, coming 6 months after the disaster at Pearl Harbor, proved that the Japanese were not invincible. The American people, who had been shocked by the early Japanese victories, now began to believe that the war could be won. As the Pacific War continued, the ghosts of Midway would haunt both sides. Every subsequent battle would be measured against the standard set in those crucial days of June 1942. The Japanese would spend the rest of the war trying to recreate the conditions that had made their early victories possible, while the Americans would build upon the foundation laid at Midway. The coral atolls of Midway, scene of one of the most decisive battles in naval history, returned to their peaceful existence. The runways were repaired, the facilities rebuilt, and the scars of battle gradually healed. But the memory of those who had fought and died there would be preserved in the annals of naval history. The Battle of Midway had proven that in modern warfare, victory belonged not to the side with the most powerful ships or the most experienced pilots, but to the side that could best combine intelligence, technology, and human courage. The Japanese air squadrons that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had indeed been erased from the skies by Midway's fierce defense, and with them went Japan's hope of victory in the Pacific War. In the end, the Battle of Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was the moment when the tide of war turned irrevocably in favor of the United States and its allies. The legacy of those 4 days in June would shape the course of the Pacific War and establish the foundation for American naval supremacy that would endure for decades to come.